Hello, you're listening to the Public Rail Now podcast. My name is Adam Barrington, and I'm the national organizer for Public Rail Now, a coalition of railroad workers, environmental justice activists, trackside community organizers, and others calling for public ownership and operation of the U.S. rail system. For more information about Public Rail Now, please visit publicrailnow.org. In this episode, I talk with economist, author, lecturer, and founder of Democracy at Work, Professor Richard Wolff, about privatization of public institutions, free market ideology, and the inefficiency of the private sector, among other subjects. Professor Wolff also hosts the weekly program Economic Update, which I highly recommend to our listeners. For more information about Democracy at Work, please visit democracyatwork.info. Thanks for listening and enjoy. Last week, I saw an article, and I'm sure that you saw it too, and it was quoting Elon Musk, who, to no one's surprise, said that we should try to privatize everything we possibly can. And he explicitly talked about Amtrak and USPS, and we can also add public education among the institutions that he'd like to put on the chopping block. And, that's not the first time we've heard somebody like Elon Musk talk about privatization. So I just wanted to see if, first of all, can you tell our listeners what exactly is privatization, and from your perspective, what purpose does privatization serve?
Okay, I'd be glad to. The term privatization developed only over, the last 200 or 300 years to handle the following situation: that in country after country, as capitalism replaced feudalism coming out of the Middle Ages, first in England and then spreading all over the world, the bulk of economic activity in this new system was handled by individuals who were private individuals in the sense, and this is all that it means, that they were not officials of any government. It was not a government activity that undertook to build the factories, the workshops, the offices, the stores. The things we generally call enterprises were undertaken by private individuals, hence the phrase private enterprise, to characterize the capitalist economy. And as I think everyone knows, private capitalist businesses, that's how the system works, are aiming to maximize one particular thing: profit. If you are profitable, then your business is considered a success and it can grow. If you don't make profits, then your career in that business is in trouble. It is unable to grow because it doesn't have that extra profit to invest and grow. And so it'll shrink, and your career likely with it. In other words, what success is profitability. And what failure is the inability to make a profit in whatever business you as a private person set up. Okay, that's the foundation. What was quickly discovered in every country, including the United States, was that maximizing profit is a kind of two-edged sword. On the one hand, you can read in the textbook, it's a wonderful incentive for people to produce goods and services, to improve them over time, to become more efficient in producing them, because those are ways to get more profit, true enough. And so capitalism exhibits economic growth from the profit incentive built in to capitalism. The problem is there are very unhappy ways to make more profit. For example, to substitute a cheaper input for the one you've been using. And why is it cheaper? Well, maybe it doesn't last as long. Maybe it doesn't work as well. Maybe it breaks down, but long after you've sold it to a gullible producer. Then there are people who see profit in producing things that are downright harmful to people. I'll pick a couple: cigarettes, alcohol, all kinds of things have been profitably produced. Here's another example. It may be that you can produce something profitably and it's a decent product, but the way that you go about producing it fouls the environment. dumps pollution into the air or the water upon which we all rely. Long story short, every capitalism in the world, without exception, has decided that we need something to regulate, something to control private enterprise. And that has to be the government. We, at least so far, haven't found much other ways of doing it. So pretty soon, governmental agencies were set up. Again, in every capitalism, without exception, government agencies were set up to supervise private enterprise, to make sure that it didn't make profits by hurting us, didn't make profits by putting us at risk of all kinds of things. We have agencies to look at the food system, because Lord help us if dangerous items are put in the food, which they always have been and which they are today, hence the need for a Food and Drug Administration, which is what we call it here. Every state in the union, all 50 of them, have utility commissions. They have insurance industry commissions. Why? Because typically electricity is provided by one or two companies. They are in a monopolistic position and they rip us off because we don't have much choice if we want electricity. And how could we live without it? We have to go to the local electric company. There aren't many choices. And so we better regulate them, or else we're going to be paying money for electricity, the likes of which you've never seen become notarized in the way that eggs have. So regulation has been a necessary part. And when the government undertakes to regulate, private enterprises hate it, and they don't want it, and they want to get rid of it. That's what Mr. Musk is. There's nothing new under the sun from Mr. Musk. Very old. You can see it in Reagan if you want to go back in this country. You can see it in Margaret Thatcher if you want to see it in action in England. All capitalist countries have had to have the government come in. That means if the government is going to do all this regulation, one of the things it has to do is hire human beings to study the situation, to come up with a regulation that works, not one that doesn't, to monitor how successful it is so you can improve how it works. In other words, you have to develop a government apparatus, a bureaucracy. This is as old as Methuselah, this wisdom. But it has always been resented by the private enterprise. They don't want to have to be able to check how much pollution comes out of their smokestack. They don't want big brother government looking over their shoulder. We need it as a people. Every country has done it, but it's always been resented. And one way to express that is to say the government is a burden. The government doesn't do it well. The government shouldn't be in the business. We, the private enterprisers, are trustworthy. We are governed by the profit incentive. That's what they keep saying. I have to tell you, in all honesty, I'm surprised that we're here still having this lame debate, because it has been settled by practice, as I can keep repeating. Every country has done it. And when countries have, under leaderships like that of Mr. Trump and Musk, and that has happened, of course, when they have undone government regulation, when they have, quote unquote, privatized by lessening or eliminating the government's interference in the economy, we have always, let me underline that, always come to regret having done it, and to go back to re-regulate one more time. All we need was that horrible food that killed off large numbers of us, or that disease we didn't have a CDC to catch and to deal with and to try to quickly develop a vaccine. Lord help us if we had relied on the private sector to deal with the pandemic. People like to say, and this is part of that debate, that it was the private Pfizer company and so on which made the vaccine. Yes, it did. But the reason Pfizer did so, which the Pfizer executives told the government, we will only do that because it's costly and risky to invest billions in developing a vaccine if you, the government, guarantee to buy hundreds of millions of doses at a nice price to give us a profit. Minus the government watching, paying, you wouldn't have had that vaccine, or you wouldn't have had it for years later, and umpteen million dead people to monitor it. So we're not going back. And if we do, if you have a moment of ideological craziness, which is what we're getting now, we will pay for it. And the end result will take us right back to where we were.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I was looking at an excerpt from your book, Understanding Capitalism, and I think it's interesting that prior to reading it, I was thinking about how whether it's libertarians or right wing economists or politicians, they always kind of clothe their arguments for the quote unquote free market and this sort of this ideology of privatization and private ownership. And I just wanted to read this really quickly. And so you write, when you cross the threshold into a workplace, for example, a factory, an office, or a store, you leave whatever democracy might exist outside. You enter a workplace from which democracy is excluded. Are the majority, the employees, making the decisions that affect their lives? The answer is an unambiguous no. And so I wanted to ask, do you think it's fair to say that, workplaces in a capitalist system are just inherently undemocratic and anti-democratic? And is it fair to say that privatization is a way to bring that sort of anti-democratic and undemocratic, those conditions of the workplace, into places that were formerly off limits, into public spaces?
Absolutely. I think that the problem that many of us feel and have felt for a long time, that the commitment to democracy by the United States is more verbiage than it is real, is not because we don't have good leaders or that kind of an argument. It's because it's built into our system. Whatever leaders we have, the workplace. And let's remember, whether it's a store, an office, or a factory, that's where most of us spend the creative hours of our adult lives. Monday to Friday, the best hours of the day, we are at work. 170 million of us making up the labor force here in this country, in the United States. And we're in a place where a very small number of people who we have not voted for, we have no power over, tell us what to do. Come here, go there, work with this machine, sit over there, report in this way, don't take more than 10 minutes in the bathroom, etc., etc., etc. They have enormous power over us, plus the ultimate power to tell us to get lost. You're fired. I'm not going to have you come here. I'm not going to give you a nickel of income. Your job, your income is gone. You took the risk of taking this job. Now I'm making you regret it. Not only by doing that do I hurt you, but of course I hurt whoever depends on you, your spouse, your children, your parents, your community. Wow, an enormous amount of power in the small hands of the owner or the board of directors if you work for a corporation. And the vast majority of people at every workplace, the employees, have no power at all. This is not only not democratic, it's the opposite. It's why we advocate for democracy, because we don't want a king. Well, we got rid of the kings in politics, but they fooled us. They changed their name to CEO and now run all the enterprises in which we are as undemocratically powerless as we used to be in the face of the kings we once had. This means that if you have a commitment to democracy with a little d, I don't mean the Democratic Party, but if you're committed to democracy as a good way for human beings to get together to do projects they care about, whether it's running a community or running a business producing goods and services, then you have to face the difficult fact that democracy has been excluded from the enterprises of the United States throughout our history. There's nothing new here. And if you're watching Mr. Trump and Mr. Elon Musk, you can see what that breeds. It breeds people who don't care. They give orders. Mr. Trump became famous because he was on a television program hiring and firing people and enjoying the power it gave him. Elon Musk is the same. Look at what they're doing with all the federal employees they're firing. They're not giving them any notice. They're not giving them any severance. They're not helping them find work. The irony I read about this morning is that people losing their jobs left and right overnight, being informed about it, when they now turn to the unemployment office to get help while they're jobless, they can't get it. You know why? Because the unemployment office has seen a lot of its workers fired by Trump and Musk also, so you're doubly whacking them. This has got nothing to do with democracy. It's exactly the opposite.
Definitely, yeah. And thinking about, we've been talking about some of these different features of privatization and the elimination of public services and institutions, and its impact on working people. And I mean, we can look at like the larger examples. Chile under the Pinochet regime, the privatization of British Rail, the French National Railways being privatized. But even like in the United States, we can go city by city basis, the water privatization in Jackson, Mississippi, where the water was turning the color of coffee and people were told to make sure that their mouths were closed while they were taking a shower, So it's just, it's very clear that it's bad for working people. So I wanted to ask, there's even among like some people that aren't in politics or academia, that aren't economists, that might not have, it would seemingly not have skin in the game for arguing in favor of something like privatization. We nevertheless see this sort of adherence to free market ideology in some sections of the working class. And so, not to get us too far into the weeds of Gramscian analysis, but why do you think this is? Where does the government can't do anything right idea come from?
Well, it comes from the business community, which is afraid. It always was afraid. And let's take a moment to look at why that's reasonable, that they would be afraid. They were always afraid of giving the government any power in economics because it would risk their having to lose the power they have. Let me explain. We live in societies which may not be democratic, but we did achieve over several hundred years of struggle what is called universal suffrage. In other words, there's a basic legal and constitutional commitment, one person, one vote in politics. So we all go on that Tuesday in November, and we go and we vote. I get one vote for my mayor, for my congressperson, my senator, my president, and so on. One person, one vote. Okay. Here then comes a problem for business. The vast majority of people are employees. A tiny minority are employers. Employers, those are the businessmen and women, the capitalists, the bosses, whatever you want to call them. According to the United States Census, 3% of Americans are employers of one kind or another. By the way, most of them are self-employed. There are people who employ themselves in some individual business. But whatever it is, let's give them 3%. You know what that means? That the other 97% of us are not employers. So there's no question that the majority of voters in any democratic system would be employees, and that they might be expected to vote their economic interests, which are not the same as those of the employer. For example, if something has to be paid for by the government and therefore they have to raise taxes, if that were democratically decided, the employees would vote that the taxes are paid by the employers. The employers could vote that it be paid by the employees. But with universal suffrage, we know exactly how that's going to come out. And the employers are horrified by the very prospect of such a thing. And I can assure any employer who might be listening that folks like us, me, and many like me on the employee side, have in mind to do exactly that sort of thing. And so they shouldn't worry. Yup, that's a serious concern. And the only way they have found to deal with that is to use a portion of the profits they get from the way capitalism delivers profits into the hands of the 3% who are employers, is to use that money to do everything in their power to make sure that the vast majority of us employees cannot or will not even try to change the situation. And how do they do it? Number one, they buy the political system. They make the president and the mayor and the congressperson depending on money to run their campaigns, to become well known enough, to get their messages to you, to get you to believe the promises they offer. They need a lot of money to hire very expensive Madison Avenue advertising firms to do this work. And they do, which is why you're confronted by it in the mass media all the time. But here's a second way, and here I'm speaking from personal experience. I've been a professor in several American universities all my life. That's been my work history. In every economics department where I've been a professor, and I'm doing that now as well, it's been obvious to me from many of my colleagues who became my friends, so we had coffee together or a dinner together, et cetera, that they understood, as I did, that if you celebrate this capitalist system, it will help your career. But if you're critical of this economic system, it will hurt your career. All kinds of grants come from wealthy corporations to help you do research if they like what you say. And those grants do not come if they don't. I've seen it over and over again. So, yeah, libertarian ideology, which is what it is an idea that says if the government does it, it will be badly done. And if it's good outcome, that's because the private made it so. They have taught that mantra, because that's what it is. They have taught it and they have rewarded it and they have paid for it and they have paid to disseminate it everywhere and anywhere, starting in elementary school right up through the university, which is why, as you rightly put it, portions of the working class, employees can get to believe that sort of thing. You know, America in one way is very odd. You have the following kind of weird situation. When large numbers of people lose their jobs, you know who they get angry at here in America? Not the employer who fired them, who chose not to hire them. They get angry at the government instead. They shake their fist at the senator or the president or the fill in the blank. If you see people that are homeless because they got thrown out of their apartment because they didn't have the rent or for whatever reason, do they get angry at the landlord? In large numbers, they don't here in the United States. They get angry at the politician. They have been so bamboozled that they don't even understand who the problem is. If you lose your home, it's a landlord who did that to you. If you lose your job, it's an employer who did that. It's not the government. You have to be taught and trained to blame the government. It's a little bit like being taught to blame the federal employee these days. Look at the effort Mr. Trump and Mr. Musk, and you don't even know half of it since they buy a lot of public relations. They're trying to get you to understand that the federal worker, the people who work for the federal government, are some kind of economic problem. They're not. They never have been. Let me show you in one couple of sentences how that's the case. The number of civilian employees, so not the Army, but the number of civilian employees of the federal government right now is 2.5 million. Our labor force in America is 160 million. So we're talking about a tiny group of people, but it's much better or worse, depending on your point of view. 60 years ago, in the 1960s, the number of people working in the federal government was 2.5 million. In other words, over the last century, we haven't increased the number of people working for the federal government, even though the population of the United States went from about 200 million in the 1960s to 340 million, which is what it is now, which means the same number of people, 2.5 million working for the federal government, are now doing work for a country that is immensely larger than what it was 50, 60 years ago. You know what that's a sign of? The efficient use. And here's the last thing. If you really cared about the quote unquote efficiency of government, and that's what they call their project, DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, well, let me tell you something which you don't want the public to know. 20 million Americans work for state and local government, compared to 2.5 million who work for the federal government. If you really cared about government efficiency, you ought to be concerned with the 20 million state and local, not the 2.5 million federal. That's just theater. That's play acting. That's counting on people not knowing. And it's also because the federal government can't fire state and local people, because that's the job of local and state politicians who wouldn't in a million years do what Trump and Musk are doing. So they're just whacking federal employees because they can. And the rest of us are watching, and we will only watch, I think, until we realize this is very, very bad business we are observing, and we better do something to stop it.
Yeah, it's funny that you bring up efficiency, because when you look at some of the larger private enterprises, like, at Public Rail Now, our big mission is the public ownership and operation of the U.S. rail system. And, we're a coalition of railroad workers, trackside community organizers, environmental justice activists, a bunch of different folks and organizations who, in some way or other are connected to the railroad and want to see it made a public utility. And it's in thinking about the railroad industry, it stands out as a failure of public or private ownership and this free market ideology, because you can see the gutted workforce, tracks and equipment are not maintained. There's disasters like the East Palestine derailment, and derailments that happen a lot more frequently than people would like to think. But there's also a lot of public subsidizing of industries like the railroad industry, and even speaking back to Elon Musk, the last I read, he received something like $38 billion in government contracts, loans, subsidies, tax credits, etc. So the thing I wanted to ask you about is there's this sort of facade of, we're efficient, we're privately owned, we're entrepreneurs and all this kind of stuff. But how much of these major industries in this country and these, wealthy capitalists like Elon Musk, how much are they actually living off of the public dollar as they are right now?
To an enormous extent, but let me pick up on what you're talking about efficiency, because it is such a, if you pardon me, such a crock. That's my job. I'm a professor of economics. I analyze economic efficiency. The conversations about efficiency in this country are I'll be as polite as I know how, misguided. And let me use the rail system and the automobile system as a wonderful example. Everyone knows who pays any attention that by far the best way to move products and people long distances is by rail, even short distances. Let me make it real clear. It is very expensive to have a private automobile based transportation system. Most of the time, just think with me as a simple set of ideas. Most of the time, most of the automobiles in this country right now are sitting somewhere doing nothing. They are sitting in a garage. They are sitting out on the street. They are sitting in your driveway. They are sitting there because you only use it for a relatively small amount of time to and from your job, to and from shopping, so forth. It is easy to show that the waste of rare oil and gas, the waste of rare metals that we're running out of in this planet, the amount of pollution produced by the private car, the single most important cause of air pollution, and on and on. All of that could be avoided if we had an enormously well-heeled rail system, by which I mean not only long-distance rail, but commuter rails, urban rail system, which we kind of have in a few big cities. We call them subways, and so on. That would be the way to do it, and it is the way in many countries it is being done. The private automobile is a mammoth inefficiency. But now let me get at it from another direction, the same point. When the automobile came out, we already had a rail system. And the automobile manufacturers, driven by profits, understood that they could not compete if they had to build the road system on which their automobile could run. Then the cost would be so high that they could never win the competition with the rail system that was already there. So what did they do? They arranged for the rail system to be treated the way you just summarized, so I won't repeat it. But even more important, the unspeakably immense subsidy that the government of the United States provided to the automobile industry, which the automobile industry wanted. And that was called the highway system of the United States. When you drive on I-95 or I-91 or I-80 or any of the other major transcontinental road system, this was a gift paid for by the American people's taxes, which mostly fall on working class people. We built the roads. So all the automobile company had to do was to build the car. And they got huge subsidies for doing that. Let me remind everyone, back in 2008, which is not ancient history, General Motors went belly up, and our tax money, 60 to 70 billion of it, were given to bail them out. And they didn't even pay it back, let alone cover it with it. That's an enormous subsidy. Without that, that company would have folded. And without that company, we don't have an American industry. So badly did they manage that industry, by the way, those big American capitalists who got the road system subsidy for themselves, that American cars are quickly disappearing. We only have American cars because we have forced foreigners to come and build the cars here. Toyota, Nissan, Tesla, whichever ones you mentioned. And around the world, dominant automobile is not the United States anymore, not by a long shot. General Motors sells more cars in China than it does here in the United States. That's where their profit is being produced. So no, there's no efficiency argument, that is pure propaganda. If you believe that efficiency is governing anything, then you're the type of person who believes the ad, which shows you someone washing in the shower with a bar of soap and telling you how that particular brand of soap will really improve your sex life. Well, you giggle when you see or hear that because you know what's going on. They're just trying to make something up to get you to buy something. Efficiency is an argument just like that. It's a piece of advertising. Every large corporation, everyone, is always worried about efficiency because you can always do a bit better than you've been doing by being more careful about this or that aspect of your work. That's how human beings develop. Hitching their argument of why you should give them what they want to the notion they're efficient and somebody else isn't is always a kind of ugly lying. And my advice, don't be fooled.
Thank you. Yes. And, in kind of keeping up with this topic, I've been thinking a lot about how the sort of the landscape of worker organizing has changed. And, we're definitely looking at some very severe contradictions and crises within our economic system that are deepening seemingly by the day. And so I wanted to ask, in your perspective, how has that landscape changed? And in thinking about, what Public Rail Now is doing and in kind of in having this ambitious demand for nationalization, but also fighting for the labor movement and emphasizing the need for worker control. We firmly believe that the folks who do the work are the ones who know how to do it best and do it the most efficiently. And I know you're a big proponent of worker co-ops, so I'm interested to hear how you think in this sort of changing landscape and in the midst of all these crises that the movement for worker co-ops and the labor movement and public institutions can all kind of come together and how we can fight things like privatization and empower working people.
Well, for me, and I'm just speaking personally here now, for me, the railroad system has been a key shaper of capitalism for at least the last century and a half. I mean, building railroads has transformed, especially the United States, from being an unimportant corner colony of Britain to being the global powerhouse that it once was. It isn't anymore, but it was for most of the second half, for example, of the 20th century. But without the transcontinental railroads and without all that those railroads made possible, means that railroad is a key industry. Imagine with me then, if you could, you and the people like you, convert our rail industry from the kind of private enterprise it was and declined under to the public, and went even further, not just make it public, but to make it a worker co-op, exactly as you say. Put it finally in the hands not of people who want to make a profit. That's what we've seen to this point. That's why we have the problems. We have to face the reality that if you leave it in the hands of the private, we will continue to have the problems that have beset that industry for so long. What about if we took it and made it a model for many other industries in America, a model of what a worker co-op organized rail system might do, one whose job was to give the best possible working conditions to the workers who are vested their lives in this work, but even more important, to serve the society. Let's see what kind of rail system we could have if it were working people who understood now it's owned and operated by the workers. Now it's focused on being a public servant. Maybe then we'll have the kind of rail systems in and out of our country that are a much better and, dare I say it, much more efficient way of moving people and goods than the automobile and truck system that is so difficult. Let me Let me conclude by focusing everybody on this weird character, Elon Musk. What he's done and what made him rich is not be efficient. He isn't particularly. If you take a look at the last few weeks of the value of Tesla stock on the stock market, it is a loser on a scale that has few equals. No, you know what Mr. Tesla did? He went to the automobile company industry, and he said, I see the end of you. You're burning fossil fuels. That's a dead end industry. It's polluting everything. And there's now a movement all over the world against using energy that way. Well, the logical, efficient, rational alternative to the private automobile and the private truck as mass transportation is, here we go, railroads of one kind or another, street railroads, underground railroads, surface railroads. That is the efficient, less polluting, less injury, better in every way. That's what we need. We need a transition from the private automobile to a really well done rail system. He didn't do that. He knew they didn't want that because they're in the auto business, and a really good rail system is the competition they don't want. Yeah, they give speeches on the 4th of July about loving competition, but they fight it every other day of the year. What we need is mass transportation, not the private automobile. What Mr. Musk became a billionaire on was giving the auto industry new profit life. Build an electric private car. Substitute for the guzzler in your garage a plug-in for your garage. It's the same irrationality, which is why he gets rewarded in capitalism, because it keeps this profit system going. Nothing would be a bigger contribution to what this country needs than to have worker co-op organized rail system to finally show the American people what a proper rail system could be. My family is European. I have been to Europe many times. I have been in their rapid train systems. Wow, you come back, you realize what it could look. It's like coming back from the Paris subway, seeing what that underground rail system, or in many European countries, what the surface rail system could do, something you even have still, for example, in Boston. We ought to be exploring and looking at the rail industry from top to bottom, because it could really help the United States on many levels now. And I salute those of you that are working to make that happen.
Thank you so much. And Professor Wolff, I know you're a busy guy, and just want to say it's an honor to have you on our program. I'm not the only one, I'm sure, who finds your work a breath of fresh air. And personally, I just want to say, as a Clevelander, it's nice to see an Ohioan out there you can be proud of. That's not J.D. Vance. So
I couldn't agree with you more. And I thank you. I really meant it. I thank you all for being in a struggle that's willing to think big and not to be limited. The problems of this country are very big. We need big, bold solutions, or else the decline we are in will continue.
Absolutely. And before we close out, where can people go to learn more about your work and the work of your colleagues at Democracy at Work?
Yeah, that's the easiest way. You can get to everything we do, and we do a lot now, by going to our website, www.democracyatwork, all one word, democracyatwork.info.
Great. All right. Yes, please check that out. Democracy at Work does some fantastic stuff, and highly recommend it to all of our listeners. So again, thank you, Professor Wolff, and I hope we can have you on in the future.
My pleasure. Call me anytime. I'd love to continue the conversation.